I know you will, I know.
We are ready.
Okay.
Okay. We are here with Elizabeth Alexander, interviewing, who has graced ourselves by accepting our request for an interview. We are very privileged to be here. We are here representing Uralpul, which is a bilingual Bengali web magazine that is aiming at bridging cultural gaps between different cultures, different countries, different languages. Thank you so very much for being here.
Thank you for traveling to see me and for your work too.
Thank you. Before the camera got started, we were talking about how you were brought up and how important you feel the process of memory is to your writing. When I read Venus Hottentot, especially that book, I saw it's practically bursting at the seams with references to mid-century African-American literary and cultural figures. And it seems like you grew up knowing many of them personally.
Some of them, but my household was very cultural. My mother's influence in that regard was huge. My parents were both New Yorkers. That's where I was born as well. And I think part of what you sense in that book that I think was very characteristic of my upbringing is the way in which everything feels accessible in that city. That city itself is bursting at the seams with culture, with language, with words, with very, very different kinds of people in close proximity to each other, crossing. So I think that was kind of the ethic that informed many things about how I looked at the world from a very, very early age.
And there is a wonderful poem in there about the house party, and where there is a reference to finding earrings, finding lost earrings to keep. It's almost like you treasured the memories from an early age in the same manner, so that you can go back to them again in an opportune moment and plumb them for your poetry.
Well, I do think, even though my memory isn't what it once was, I think children just suck that all up. I have been blessed with a very sharp memory, and I'm often aware of that. I remember details, and I remember them vividly, and I remember words, and I remember small things very, very sharply and vividly. And so I think probably that particular gift is part of what led me to a life as an artist. You've got to do something with it. What else really would you do with it? And in that poem in particular, I think the world of grown-ups as I perceived it as a child, that there was something kind of burnished and magical about the way grown-ups would be grown-ups together, and what it was to be a child on the periphery of that, wanting to understand it a little better, wanting to have keepsakes of it, that's kind of where I was at that time, writing the book in my 20s, looking back and sort of plumbing the memories of the early years.
And yearning to be a part of the same grown-up world, in a sense.
Absolutely, although of course when we get there, we realize that it never is as we imagine it to be.
Yes, it's always evolving and changing with us. But you have been present in a few moments that has held so much historical significance. I have read, correct me if I'm wrong, that you were at the historical speech at the Washington Mall.
The March on Washington.
When you were just 1 year old, and then you talk about your father being, running for a mayoral elect in the city of Washington, D.C. These moments, do you go back to them now? Now your process is so memory intensive. Do you go back to them at different times and walk away with different significance?
Well, I think the funny thing about large moments is that what we see as iconic is often doesn't necessarily seem iconic when we're experiencing it. The inaugural would be an exception. Knew that was a big day. And what I've said before that I think is very important about the March on Washington is that there was nothing extraordinary about my parents taking me. For people of all colors who believed in progress, I don't know, millions of people who assembled that day, there was no question but that we would go, because it was the moment with Dr. King, who everybody knew was carrying a message that was so vital and so important, everybody, I think, must have known that he was a messenger in a certain kind of way. And so not to go would have been a refusal of that forward vision that so many people cared about, and in the case of my parents, that was a big piece of what they were working toward. So of course we went. Of course we went.
Do you think back, or can you almost looking back now reimagine yourself in the moment as a 1-year-old?
I've certainly done that. I grew up in Washington, D.C. after we moved from New York, and passing the mall, going over the mall a million times, and going to the mall as an adult for other marches, because I think that's something so wonderful about Washington as a civic city. When I was growing up, there were always marches, a lot of anti-Vietnam War marches, the later March on Washington, women's suffrage marches for women's issues and women's rights. That was just, it was matter of fact that people would be gathered on the mall to try to push for change. And that was actually rather a nice tradition to grow up in, especially when you see, it's important to remember, I mean, today all we're hearing in the news is about the protests in Iran and how, so many people have died marching for their point of view. So I do consider that a very precious way of thinking about some of what is wonderful in the legacy of this complicated and contradictory country.
And stay engaged in the moment and staying engaged with your ancestry and your history.
Yes.